Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching initial configuration of Cisco UCS. Now it's time to get on the keyboard and do some configuration. So in this lesson, we're going to start bringing up the interconnects and getting those guys online and doing some very basic configuration in UCS Manager. So we're going to start with starting the initial configuration. This is, basically a kind of a rehash at the end of the last lesson where we talk about your site survey, IP addresses, DNS names, making sure you have all that ready to go. Then connecting to the interconnect. So we'll use a console connection, bring the interconnects up, configure one, and then configure the other, and make sure they're clustered together. After that, we'll fire up UCS and use UCS Manager for the first time, and we'll do that to make some kind of basic configuration settings. We'll configure the chassis discovery policy, the chassis power policy, MAC table aging policy, DNS servers, time zone, and probably a few other things while we're in there, such as maybe syslog or some of the other things that you're going to want to set on day one. So with that, let's get ready. Let's get started. So starting the initial configuration, usually the first thing we do on a deployment, and you'd probably want to do for yourself if you're doing your own deployment of UCS, is kind of getting some information together. We talked about this, I believe, in the last lesson, and it's basically just getting things together. If you have a naming standard, go ahead and set up a name for the interconnects, which will then transition into a name for the cluster itself. So when you give it a name, it's going to put -A for the first interconnect and -B for the second interconnect to kind of denote those two. You're going to set a password for the admin account. You can have the option of setting a complex password. I'm going to tell you to go ahead and do that for any production environment. Go ahead, get that ready to go. And then you're going to need 3 static IP addresses. You're going to need one for Interconnect A, one for Interconnect B, and then a third IP address is kind of a virtual IP address shared by the cluster. So if Fabric A is currently the primary, he's going to hold that IP address, but should he fail, Fabric B will pick it up. You need to make sure these 3 IPs are all on the same IP subnet. Normally they're sequential, but it doesn't have to be, but they need to be on the same subnet because you're going to specify one subnet mask, one default gateway, and then we'll set up DNS server and domain name for the system. So go ahead and get that ready. Connecting to the interconnects is pretty simple. Well, it's simple if you've done connectivity to a Cisco device before. If you've never done that, it seems kind of convoluted, but it's not. You're going to connect via serial cable. There's probably within your box of parts for the interconnects, there's a blue console cable. You may look at that and go, I don't have a computer with a serial port anymore. It's like, when's the last time I had one of those? So if you're like me, you probably need a USB to serial adapter cable. Those are cheap. They're easy to get. I got mine at Radio Shack one day when I needed one in a hurry. And what you do is you plug it into the USB, you plug your serial cable into that, and it'll emulate a COM port under, say, Windows. So under Windows, you'll probably use something like HyperTerminal to connect and be your terminal application. That's normally the case. Even as a Mac user, I fire up a VM, and I still use HyperTerminal because that's what I've used for 20 years or something. And there's no great terminal application for Mac for whatever reason. So that's what I suggest. So get your console cable. We're going to plug that into the first interconnect that we're going to configure. Normally when we do deployments, we make the top interconnect Fabric A, the bottom one B, so we will do the top one first. You're going to plug that into the console cable or console port. Depends again, if you remember from previous lesson, that it depends where that is, depending on if it's a 6100 or a 6200. Look at it, plug it in the right place, plug your serial port in and or your USB adapter, make sure that the driver installs, and then you're ready to go. Inside your terminal application, you're going to want to set it to 9600 baud, 8 data bits, no parity, 1 stop bit, and no flow control. I confirm this. I've never done a 6200 config from the ground up, but documentation shows it is still 9600 baud. I know some of the newer Cisco devices have actually changed that finally to like 115/200, but it appears the interconnects are still the same. So get that ready, and we'll get ready to start your initial configuration. So on the initial walkthrough, what we're going to do in the lab is we will do just like you're going to do. We will configure 2 interconnects. The top one, we're going to give him a lot of information. His IP address and information, as well as the cluster IP and information. Also set the admin password. Then we will do the second interconnect. When we do the second one, we don't have to give it nearly as much. It'll pull it from the primary. Go ahead and have the information that we noted earlier. Keep it nearby. And for this demo, I'm actually going to be using PuTTY. So don't let that throw you. But in the lab here, I've got kind of a serial concentrator that I will telnet into. And that's how I'll get to my two interconnects. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started in the lab. So to start the lab, let's go ahead and we'll launch PuTTY. So again, normally you're going to use something like HyperTerminal with a serial connection, but I'm using a concentrator in the lab, so therefore I'm going to use PuTTY. Telnet in, and then it's got a serial connection plugged into the interconnects. I've already got my IPs and everything loaded here, so I'll go ahead and connect to Fabric A. Let me expand this window just in case. Hit enter, and we get the first question. Enter the configuration method. There's two methods, console and GUI. Basically, if you choose GUI, you can punch in an IP address and then web into the interconnect and do the same thing as we're about to do via text. I personally don't see the value of doing that, so we're just going to do it via console. So, enter the setup mode. We're going to do setup. This means we're going to do a new setup, a new install. You can do a restore and restore an existing configuration. So maybe you had to replace an interconnect, had to RMA one and do a restore. There's also a process that if you maybe you have 6120s or 6140s and you want the new 6248s, there's a process to roll those and restore and do all that. But today we're just going to do a setup. New Fabric Interconnect, yes. Enforce strong passwords, yes. Remember, I said some things you can do in a lab, some things you need to do in production. Strong passwords are a production thing. So let me go ahead and punch in a password. There we go. So, is this Fabric Interconnect part of a cluster? Select no for standalone. You can do a standalone interconnect. It's a lab environment thing only. Cisco really doesn't want to support you in production, rightfully so. It's kind of like a one-arm configuration. If you lose that interconnect, all your chassis go down. So, is this part of a cluster? Yes, it is. I'm not even sure why they default that to no. Is this A or B? A. And enter the system name. So my system name is GSO UCS Lab. Remember, it's going to put -A on the end of it and -B on the end of it. So we've got cable plugged into management 0. You have your cable plugged into management 0, right? Whatever that is, we need to give it an IP address. So for us, it's 10.130.17.6. Again, this is the IP of this interconnect, not the cluster. Enter the net mask and enter the default gateway. Cluster IP version 4 address is 10.130.17.5. This will be that virtual IP that floats amongst the interconnects. And do I want to configure a DNS server? If you do, you can enter it now. If you don't enter it now, we do it through UCSM like we will do here in a minute. Then when we do that, you can do it via the GUI or the UCSM GUI, or you can do it here. I'll say yes. This is Google's DNS server, just for lab purposes. Then do you want to enter a default domain name? I'm going to say no for now. We can add that again later. So apply and save the configuration. Yes, you want to confirm everything on the screen is what you wanted. Switch Fabric A, system name, password, 10.130.17.6, 255.250, correct gateway, correct DNS, yes. So it's going to go ahead and apply that, and now we can get ready to do the second interconnect. We'll say OK, we'll launch PuTTY, Fabric B, okay. And it clicked me out. While I'm doing this, you can see here in the background that Fabric A is now online. And if you look, GSO UCS-lab-A, so it added the -A to the end. Now for B, why is that one giving me trouble? I just tested it. Oh, that's why. My port's wrong. 2077, not 207. Say OK. And there we are. Always the little things. Resize the window. We'll say console. Installers detected the presence of a peer fabric interconnect. Will you be adding this one to the cluster? We'll say yes. That means that my cables L1 to L1, L2 to L2 were correct. Say yes. So what is the password of the peer interconnect? So I can pull down configuration information. So I'll type that in. and it will connect and pull down what it needs. So it's retrieving the configuration from the peer interconnect. That's good. It means it logged in. Now it wants to know what the IP address is. So it shows you the IP of the peer. It shows you the cluster. Now it wants you to assign one to this interconnect. Apply and save configuration. Yes. And now it's going to do the same thing as the other one did, where it's going to restart. Well, not really do a fully restart. It's going to apply the configuration, and then you'll see it log in as Fabric B. And there we are, Fabric B. We can even log into it, to an admin, and password. Do a show cluster state. And let's see, A is C. So the cluster is now forming. We did a show cluster state. B is up, inapplicable. Management services down. Basically, an election is in process to decide who is going to be primary and who is going to be secondary. Now we're good. So if you want to check it, that's how. Run it again, and what do we see? B is up, subordinate. A is up, primary. It's doing the switch over, and eventually HA will be ready. There we go. Well, almost ready. Still says HA not ready, but it's really exciting to watch this work. So B is up, primary, or I'm sorry, A is up in primary, B is up, subordinate. No devices connected to this Fabric Interconnect because we haven't specified any of the port configurations yet. And eventually HA will go ready. This is a lab. I've done this many times. And we'll just let that go. But that's the basic configuration for the interconnects. And now we can kind of go into them, do UCSM, and do the rest of our configuration from there. So let's go back to the slide deck. Okay, now that the initial configuration is done, it's time to jump on and use UCS Manager for the first time. So you should already be familiar with UCS Manager because, we used it earlier when we did our walkthrough. So we're going to log into UCS Manager, point the browser to the cluster IP that we just configured. If you need to download Java for your environment, go ahead and do that and get that ready. And then we're going to set some basic options. Again, chassis discovery, power policy, and MAC address table aging. Just some things that kind of, to be honest, don't really fit any of the other configuration lessons we'll be doing. And normally these are things that you set up first anyway. So it's good to go ahead and get them done. And then you really don't have to worry about them again. The first one we'll do is chassis discovery policy. Chassis discovery is kind of simple. Basically, when you connect a new chassis, it's going to define the minimum number of uplinks from the chassis to the Fabric Interconnect. So basically from those FECs up to the interconnects. And so select the lowest option you plan to use. Really, you could say one link and cover yourself for everything, but if you want to make sure and so that the minimum is set to at least 2 or 4 or even 8 with the newer modules, just set the minimum. So we'll do that first, probably set it to 2 or something like that and allow, but set it for what you deem necessary. My suggestion is if you plan to do, let's say you're doing your initial chassis first and you're doing 4 and 4, don't go ahead and set it for 4. If you plan to add any lower I/O capacity or lower I/O kind of chassis later, I'd go ahead and set it to 2 up front. Next is power policy. Power policy specifies how the power supplies in the chassis are configured. So we've talked about this as well. You can set for non-redundant with no power supply redundancy. Really, I'd only do that in a lab environment. N+1, so you basically have one power supply acting as a spare. And grid, where the power supplies are split across 2 power sources. Therefore, you have feeds from one side, feeds from another side, and the chassis splits the 4 power supplies 2 and 2 across 2 different kind of power feeds. So pick the one that's appropriate for your environment, and we'll set that there. Then MAC aging. So the MAC address table aging specifies how long MAC addresses are known before they're aged out of the interconnects. This wasn't even an option on like the original releases of UCSM. It never aged things out. Now we go ahead and let it do that just for kind of other purposes, but my suggestion is you just leave it default. Unless you have a really good reason to change the MAC address aging here, I would not change it. You have to remember that interconnects only learn MAC addresses from the blades and the servers underneath them. They don't learn MAC addresses from the outside world. There's just no reason to. Basically, if he doesn't know about it, it's obviously not one of the blades that he cares about. Therefore, he knows it's the outside world. So go ahead and just leave this default. That's what we're going to do, but I want to explain what the purpose of that was. Then DNS servers and time zones. We kind of showed you where this was at in the walkthrough section, but we'll go ahead and configure these. So configure a couple of DNS servers, configure time zones. We'll probably go ahead and do some other things in the administrative tab, things like syslog and some of that stuff, just so you see how to do that. So now it's time to actually do it. So we're going to jump over to the lab and perform some initial configuration with UCSM. We're going to use the lab that we've already used before that we did the initial UCS walkthrough with. So some of this is already configured, but it doesn't stop us from configuring it again. So we're going to do the different policies, chassis, power, MAC table aging, set some DNS server, set some time zone, as well as a few other settings. So again, let's jump over to my lab. Here we are in UCS Manager and get ready to do our configuration. So let's collapse. Well, that's a little bit too much. There we go. So let's assume this is our first time in here. And the first thing we're going to do is go to the Equipment tab, top of the Equipment tree, and we're going to look for policies here to the right. So we'll click that, and here's pretty much what we talked about. So this has changed a little bit from my screenshot. If you notice, my screenshots were on UCSM 1.4. This is 2.0, so some of these things are a little bit different. Starting at the top, though, it's still pretty much the same order. Chassis discovery policy, we have the option of 1, 2, 4, 8, or Platform Max. Platform Max means, what if I have 2104x prefixes and 2208x prefixes? Then you can say, okay, whatever's the maximum for the chassis. For us, we're going to do less than that. I'm just going to go ahead and say 2. Then, link grouping preference. Change that back. One thing you will notice in UCSM, if you make a change, it notes that there, so you'll notice save some things. I'm going to say none, but we can specify if we rather have port channels or non-port channels. Again, you have to have 2208s for port channels, so kind of keep that preference choice in mind. One thing I showed you earlier was the help, so if you want to help on something, maybe you don't understand this, click that, click this, and up this comes. So link preference specifies whether links from the I/O modules to the fabric interconnects are grouped in a port channel. So it just kind of tells you what your options are. Close that. Rack server discovery policy, we didn't talk about this. We don't have any rack servers. Power policy, non-redundant, N+1 or grid. Non-redundant because we're in a lab environment without redundant power. MAC table aging, we're just going to leave this as default. Again, if we have a question, we can set this to things such as your table time. So default is a default value. If the interconnect is set to in host mode, which ours is, or are since there are 2 of them, the default is 14,500 seconds. If you move it to switching mode, it's going to be set to 5 minutes. So go ahead and leave that as default. Global power allocation. I talked earlier about how you can put power caps and power budgets. We're just going to leave that as policy driven as default. So that's pretty much it for the basic setup policies, and then we go over to the admin tab. And on the admin tab we have a few things here. We can do, let's see, first we want to do things like DNS. So you come to DNS management. You should already have DNS server in there. You probably already have one from the initial configuration, but if you want to add others or change it, just hit plus and type the IP address in. If you have one you don't like, highlight it, and then you can just throw it away. Time zone management was another one. So we can do things here like NTP and time zone. So select your appropriate time zone for local time from the list, and then pick an NTP server address. If you don't have one internal and UCSM has access outside, you can use one of the NTP org pool addresses. Just go Google for NTP server and grab one from the NTP org pool. That works really well. It's also suggested just for this and many other logging things to go ahead and have one internal, but it's not a requirement. So set that up. Finally, back up at the top, we want to take a look at auditing here, and you can set syslog. Syslog is very simple. It's got local destinations and remote destinations, local sources. One thing you can do is say, okay, remote destination is enabled. What level do we want to have? And you can set what sort of events. I mean, all the way from debugging, where it's going to go it's going to throw everything at syslog, which is highly not recommended. Puts load on this, puts load on your syslog server, all the way up to emergencies. Usually we're going to pick somewhere in the middle. Critical is one. I would probably go somewhere around warnings would be what I would do, but you pick that. Then pick the IP address of your syslog server, whatever it is, should have that. If you don't have a syslog server, I'll just give you a little hint. Go check out like Splunk, SPLUNK. That's a great syslog server with really good searching capabilities, and so it's very useful other than just a standard syslog server. So put the IP address there, and then the facility. So if you've never used syslog, syslog has what are known as facilities. There's like 8, 0 through 7 local facilities, kind of like user defined. So if you have one of those unused, you can say, okay, UCS Manager uses local 3, and then when it's logged, it'll go just to local 3. That way you're not, having a bunch of stuff logging to one place and having to pull it apart with some sort of a tool. If you use Splunk, it's not a big deal, but it's still, good to have. And you can have multiple syslog servers. So maybe you want certain things to go to one, certain things to go to another. It gives you that option. If you changed any of this, go ahead and hit Save Changes. Let's see, what else might you need to set? User management, you'll probably do that. We'll talk about that later. If this is a new production install, let me discard changes, you're probably going to want to set up call home. So call home you can set up with Cisco and for TAC so that it'll call home with information should you have a problem. Fill this stuff in here. You'll have it all there and be able to set your SMTP server here for any sort of communication. If you use Snmp, let's say you want to do Snmp monitoring, here under Communication Services, we can enable Snmp, set your community usernames and your community strings, and configure any traps and end users. So we don't do that here in the lab, but you can absolutely do it there. So often we will raise the number of seconds for flapping interval. I believe we normally do 30. And that way when it kind of waits 30 seconds between so you don't get a lot of things in the log. That's just kind of something that we do as a best practice. You can set that for your environment. So that's really it for the initial configuration. I mean, it's just some standard kind of overriding policies, discovery policies for the chassis and how you want those to default, power policies for the chassis, and then Snmp, call home configurations, additional DNS servers. NTP is a big one, especially if you're using logging, and time zone. So make sure those are set correctly, and then you're ready to really start configuration. So let's go back to the slide deck. And that's pretty much it. So the initial configuration isn't very complex. I mean, you saw what we did there. We started with starting the initial configuration where we talked about kind of the site planning and site survey that we need, IP addresses, cluster and interconnect names, and just getting ready for the configuration so we didn't get held up partway through. Then we connected to the interconnect. So using a USB console or a USB to serial adapter and or just a straight serial connection to the console, we were able to start up that initial configuration where we assigned the initial IPs, cluster IP, password, and all of that. We did that on the first interconnect, then we did it on the second interconnect. They came together and created the cluster. After that, we logged into UCSM for the first time. When we did that, we walked through several configuration options, including configuring the chassis discovery policy for the minimum number of uplinks, configuring the chassis power policy for how we wanted to use the power supplies, whether they were redundant, non-redundant, and what type of redundancy. We set the MAC table aging, which most of the time we're just going to leave as default, but depending on your version of UCSM, you want to confirm that it is set for default. After that, we did several things: confirm DNS servers, set local time zone, set NTP, configured syslog if we needed it, and you may want to configure call home if you're in a production environment. So all in all, this should probably take you, I don't know, first time you do it, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on how how cautious you are with everything that you do, but it's really not that bad. After this, we're going to start really getting into the configuration with the network configuration and then storage configuration.